Okay. Buonasera a tutti. Good evening, everybody. My name is Joseph Weiler, totally forgettable, but this is the legendary Giorgio Napolitano, the President of the Italian Republic. Now, normally on an occasion like this, I would stand in front of you and for the next 10 minutes go through the biography and all the achievements and distinctions of our guest. But we don't have to do that today because the President has kindly agreed that we will not only speak on the current circumstance of Europe and of Italy and of the world and of the relationship between Europe and the United States. But a lot of people are here, President, because they're interested in you. For many people, especially in this delicate moment, you represent Italy, the best of Italy. And it's for your presence. Your name is Napolitano. You grew up in Naples. You were in Naples during the Second World War. You were part of the resistance, La Resistenza. It was a very different Italy. It was a very different Europe. It was a different Naples even, perhaps. So maybe for the next just 3 or 4 minutes, try and bring that time back to life. You as a young man in Naples during the Second World War.
Thank you, Professor Weiler, and thank you for inviting me and for your very kind words. Well, it didn't happen exactly yesterday, but I'll try to say something, and perhaps we can speak of Naples and Italy before September 43 and after September 43, because the first part of that period was Italy in war and Naples still during Italy in war. The second part was Naples already liberated but in terrible conditions. And until the 8th of September, when Italy practically surrendered, war was going on, and what I remember, what has been strongly impressed in me, was the long period, about 1 year, August 42, August 43, of heavy Allied bombings on Naples. I never forgot the very long nights, so many nights, dozens of nights, I spent in an underground shelter which had been excavated into the foundations of a big historical building in front of my house. And that was a very heavy experience, of course. And there were in those caverns an unbelievable variety of people. You could find there aristocratic families, upper middle class families, very poor families, practically vis-à-vis the bombs and in the fear, we were all equal. Anyhow, that has been a pretty tough experience, which ended after Italy surrendered. Naples was liberated on October 1st, 1943, after 3 days of popular resistance against the Nazi, which had occupied Naples and which were obliged to leave it. And
where were you on that day?
I was in Naples. And of course the arrival of American troops was enthusiastic, also because, you know, during the bombings, nobody was pushed to hate allies. The way we were living bombing was the fault is of Mussolini and of the war, not the contrary. And when the American troops arrived in Naples and they stayed for quite a long period, they were never felt as occupying forces. There was such a mixture, human mixture between American soldiers, but above all American soldiers, and the Neapolitan population in a terrible chaos. It was a chaos, or you can say, if you want to exaggerate a little bit, apocalypse, because the city was destroyed, was ravaged, and there were very curious and sensational social changes because the middle class was absolutely impoverished because there had been the devaluation, all savings were destroyed. On the other hand, thanking the black market, the poor people got rich, and there was a very curious transformation. And this black market was jointly managed by the Neapolitan population, a part of it, and a part of occupying forces. Very brotherly.
The great equalizer, the black market. What is your strongest, most abiding memory from that period? If you look back and you say there was one event, one day, one thing that happened that writ itself into my consciousness.
Well, generally speaking, I could say the 25th of July 1943, when we heard at the radio the news that Mussolini had been fired by the king. The king obliged Mussolini to resign, and Mussolini was taken away by Carabinieri. That was the end of fascism. And of course, this evening was rather bouleversant for all of us, also for me. I was exactly 18 years old, but I was waiting for that moment because since the previous autumn 42, I entered the University of Naples as a student, and I immediately got in touch with a group of students a little older than me who were already actively anti-fascist. I have no merits in the resistance as such.
What did you study at the university?
Law. Law. And so I understood many things in those months. We discussed continuously. We were discussing the Communist Manifesto of Marx, and we were discussing Croce. It was a very alive group of young people. Some of them became famous also in the artistic and literary life. I don't know if you have heard of an Italian regisseur, the author of films like Giuliano, Enrico Mattei, Franco Rosi. Franco Rosi was one of those I met in those occasions, and I remember that in the last months of 42, when we heard that American forces had arrived in Northern Africa, we organized a big, a grande festa. That was our spirit. And personally, you asked me to quote an event. It was the day in which, autumn 42, I reached the conclusion that my country, Italy, had to lose the war, that we had to hope and wish Italy would be defeated. It was not a simple conclusion to reach for a boy of a rather traditional family, but discussing with those friends, I understood that that was the only way to get rid of fascism and to have a new beginning for my country.
So, President, most of our discussion today will be about politics and your role as a political figure, but indulge us. Tell us just a little bit about your family, your father, your mother, your siblings, just your background. What are your roots?
Well, my background was a classical one of a middle-class family in Naples. My father was a very successful criminal lawyer. He was of liberal formation. He was not fascist, and he was not anti-fascist. And it was not so strange in Italy. People who were out of politics, who observed more or less skeptically, and who were not active at all. But he had a formidable library, and I found all what I could need to educate myself on the books he collected for many decades. And when I took my political path, there was a contrast, a serious contrast with him, because he was liberal also in the sense of the new, after the fall of fascism, liberal party, which was a democratic party of the right. It was the party of Benedetto Croce. And for him, the fact that I was oriented towards the Communist Party was really a shock. And it took several years to have again a common feeling. For several reasons, he finally appreciated my political commitment. But we had a rather complicated period.
Who doesn't? And a word about your mother?
Well, my mother was not active. She didn't work. She was only engaged at home, in family. We were four children. She was strongly, deeply Catholic. She was active more or less in the church. She came from a good family, a rather well-placed family in Neapolitan society. Her parents were from Piemonte. The surname of my mother was Bobbio, so she clearly came from Piemonte.
I see. I read that you were an aspiring actor.
Well, not exactly. I loved theater, but only once in my life when I was 18 years old, only once I was an actor, and it was just a one-act play. So it was not a big demonstration of my capacity as an actor. I was much more interested in writing about theater, in making comments on theatrical events. I wrote some essays. This was my, let's call it, specialization. In 1945, I was for 1 year the film commentator of a daily newspaper, but I loved theater very, very much.
Do you still love the theater?
I still love it.
And who is your
I frequent it a little less.
Who is your favorite playwright?
Well, I loved first very much Ibsen, and the second Chekhov. And these have remained, well, of course, later I knew so many other authors, Bertolt Brecht and so on, but the first my loves in theater were Ibsen and Chekhov, rather different, the one from the other, but very important authors.
Before we leave this period in your life, one last question. Very often, it's not always the case, but very often one's political outlook, one's Weltanschauung, is formed by an encounter, by a very special teacher, by an important book that one has read, etc. Is there such a formative experience in your life as a young person, some event, some person, some book that can say, this set my path?
Well, a great influence on me was undoubtedly played by a book which was published in Italy, 47, I was then 22, Letters from Prison by Antonio Gramsci, because it was a combination of an ideal vision of politics and of sacrifice for one's own ideas, and at the same time an example of linkage between politics and culture. I would say that this has been the fundamental choice of my life, to combine politics and culture. And I personally think that one of the problems of Italy today is that there has been a divorce between politics and culture.
And to my students are here, if you haven't read Letters from the Prison by Antonio Gramsci, recommended reading.
Yes.
I want to fast forward. So in the late 90s and early years of 2000, you were a member of the European Parliament. In fact, that's when we met. And I want to ask you about the current state of European democracy, and especially the democratization of the European Union. And the proposition that I want to put to you is that at some level it's in deep trouble. And the evidence I want to suggest why I think it's in deep trouble and should be concern for us is exactly, if we look at the European Parliament, years ago, the first direct elections in 1979, there was a relatively low turnout to the European Parliament. But at that time we said, well, it's a parliament without powers. Why would the people go and vote for something that has no power? But over the last 25 years or so, the European Parliament has gained considerable powers. In a real sense, it's the co-legislature together with the Council of Ministers. A little bit like the House of Representatives and the Senate. A little bit, not exactly. And yet, the participation in elections to European Parliament has declined with every election. The last election in 2009, for Europe as a whole, it was 43%. For Italy in 1979, it was 85%, and in 2009, it was 65%. For the East European countries, some of them, the turnout is 25%. And we should not compare it, say, to the United States. We should compare it with national politics, where the rate of participation is high. Wouldn't you think that really something strange, wrong, troubling is going on?
Yes, I don't deny it is up to a certain extent strange and by sure worrying. But democratization of the European Union is a very complex problem. I dealt with it for several years. Anyhow, we must distinguish, because on the institutional plan, the fact of the direct election of the European Parliament and the big strengthening of the powers of the European Parliament has been a great step forward, a democratization of the European Union as regards the institution. The participation in the European election is another aspect of the problem, according to me. And we can wonder where there has been a disaffection, there has been a disillusion explaining such a low turnout of the election. But we should not underrate the objective difficulty. There is a problem of dimension. When you have a decision-making process which reaches such a dimension, we are no more in Athens, of course. It was much simpler to have a popular democratic participation in Athens or in the old city-states. Second, it was even not so difficult to have participation vis-à-vis national parliaments, within national states. When you have such a complex and vast decision-making body, we have now 738 European parliamentarians for 500 million citizens. That means one parliamentarian each 700,000 citizens. The distance between the elected and the electors is enormous, and it's very difficult to feel it. I try to say something also on this subject, because I think that what is important is the dimension, the parliamentary dimension in general terms of the European construction. That means also very much relations between the European Parliament and national parliaments, because a European Parliament will never be able to reach a relevant part of his electors, and only strictly tying his activity with the activity of national parliamentarians, the problem perhaps can be solved. Anyhow, it's a very complex problem. Also, when we speak of globalization, we must democratize globalization. How to have deciding bodies which can have a serious relationship with masses of hundreds of millions of people. So I think we need a reflection. I don't say that we cannot do something to ameliorate also the participation in European election, but for instance, we need more European actors, because if political parties remain national parties and social organizations remain purely national organizations, it's impossible to build a public space, a European public space, and to have a real participation. So we have to work on several elements in order to have more democratic participation of citizens in this process.
The thing that is worrying is the decline.
Yeah.
That in and of itself, the size, etc., would explain that we could not get the same kind of commitment or involvement as we have in national politics. But what I find so disturbing is that it seems to get worse with every cycle of elections. Rather, you would have thought that slowly political organizations, trans-European, would emerge. Could it be connected, and this is me speaking, it's not the President speaking, with a kind of, not just a problem of democracy, but perhaps European integration is less popular? Maybe I can press a little bit further. We see in France with Marianne Le Pen, we see in Holland with Wilders, we see in many European countries, to be popular very often now is to be anti-European. Yeah. Do you have a sense, and I'm not speaking only about Italy, but I'm speaking about Europe more generally, that the whole project of European integration has reached a kind of plateau, or maybe there's a certain type of disillusion setting in?
No, you are right. Of course, the European Union or the European community was more popular in the golden periods of great economic growth and social advancement. And it seemed to be the result of the European construction, also for new member states. Well, as a matter of fact, Spain was radically transformed, modernized, and improved after the accession to the European Union. No wonder that in that period in Spain, the European community was so popular. And things have changed when the rate of growth has become lower, new difficulties have come to surface, and European institutions have become a very comfortable scapegoat for national governments, which are not able to give answers to the problems of the country, which are not willing to take their own responsibilities if a problem has not been solved, and put the blame on the famous Brussels Commission, this monster which is responsible for all failures, for all dissatisfaction. I think that national political leaderships have the moral duty, perhaps you will say it's exaggerate to use this expression, the moral duty to tell the truth about what is their responsibilities and what are the responsibilities of European institutions for what is being decided and for what is not being decided. And perhaps it's time also to discuss openly about the expectations, which cannot be excessive. It cannot be excessive because the world has changed. And we can like it or not, but the role of Europe is shrinking demographically, economically, politically. The very center of economic relations and even political relations has shifted away very, very far from Europe. So people should also understand that this is the historical period we are entering or we are already living in. And probably new generation will not have such a guaranteed advancement vis-à-vis the achievements of their fathers. So we need really a new commitment for telling the truth. And perhaps in that case, we'll have also more appreciation for what the European Parliament and the European institutions do. Because without them, our future would be much, much worse.
You know, in English we say that failure is always an orphan, but in Europe it seems that failure is always, it's not an orphan. You can blame Europe or you can blame the Commission. But let's talk a little bit, not about the democracy and citizens' response, but about the political institutions themselves. And it's true that the famous planned Constitution for Europe did not pass. It was rejected in the same France and Holland. But we got the Treaty of Lisbon, which by most account is the Constitution of Europe with a different dress. And one of the things that the Constitution and now the Treaty of Lisbon was meant to achieve was to give, especially in relations with the world, greater coherence. So the famous attributed to Henry Kissinger, when I need Europe, who do I phone? Was meant to get an answer because there would be a president of the Council of Ministers and there would be a foreign minister, although we call her the High Representative. But the reality seems to have backfired. So if we take an event like Libya, so when Obama needs to phone somebody in Europe, he doesn't call Barroso, he doesn't call Van Rompuy, he certainly doesn't call Lady Ashton. He calls the same old people, Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy. And when Europe, which was meant to have its strength and position, its ability to speak with one voice, they go to the Security Council, we find France and Britain voting one way and Germany voting another way. Even the Euro crisis, which is the heart of the European Economic and Monetary Union, we find the states in disarray, with Finland seems to be putting the brakes on what would be a package for everybody. Would you say that from that point of view, harshly, Lisbon is a failure, less harshly is a disappointment?
Well, I was a partisan of the Constitutional Treaty. I worked for it. And I think that also the Brussels Convention, which worked out the draft Constitutional Treaty, could have gone farther. I remember that at a certain point, Giscard d'Estaing, who was the president, with Giuliano Amato, you know very well, who was the vice president, made a proposal for the composition of the Commission. They said the Commission was conceived by Jean Monnet as a supranational institution, a supranational body, not an ensemble of national representatives. So we should have in the future, whatever is the number of the member states, only 12 members of the Commission who represent the common European interest, not a sum of purely national interest. Well, the proposal was immediately put aside. But anyhow, what was written, after all, not only in the Constitutional Treaty, but also in the Lisbon Treaty, could help in a certain direction. Two new figures were created. the so-called permanent or stable President of the Council, and the High Representative for the Foreign and Security Common European Policy, Vice President of the Commission. But when the moment came for the heads of government in the European Council to make choices, to appoint people, well, the only concern was not to appoint two prestigious people, because they, the heads of national government, should remain the master of the Union. That is the reality. We still have such a reluctance of national government to accept the idea that they already renounced some portion of national sovereignties in favor of supranational institutions, and then the consequence is to give more authority, more power to the institutions of the Union. There is such a reluctance to accept this that the consequence has been rapidly seen, in spite of all efforts of the two figures I mentioned. Of course, I am a gentleman, so I'll not speak of the lady who was appointed High Representative. I can speak more freely of Van Rompuy. Van Rompuy is a very serious person, but of course he has not been given the authority to chair the body in which all national heads of government used to sit and discuss. He's making an effort, but too slowly, too little. Well, somebody who believes in Europe and who has perhaps a more, a more philosophical vision of the political and institutional evolution says, but what do you want? 60 years are such a short period of time to change the history of Europe, which has been for centuries a history of national states divided and at war, one against another. We must be patient. It will take time. Well, I am a little more impatient than them. Also, perhaps they are younger than I, so they can be more patient. But independently from this, we need to go on much more rapidly, because otherwise the new world will not be waiting for Europe.
Do you, in this respect, favor Europe de vitesse, due tempi? That's a Europe where there will be a core group that will go further in its integration and a periphery. Because now with 27 states...
we already had two examples, Schengen and Euro. In both cases, only a certain number of member states decided to put together their initiatives, their forces, and create something in common, which would not embrace the totality of the member states. We go on more quickly. We'll see who will follow us. And as a matter of fact, as regards the Euro, it started with 11, now it is with 17 member states. And recently, the finance minister of Germany, Schäuble, who is a seriously European-minded politician, wrote, well, we never thought Euro or Schengen in order to divide, but in order to march more quickly and hoping that the rest will follow. I don't know if we can use the formula very well known and very questionable of two speeds Europe, but I think that also the reinforced cooperations which are foreseen in the Lisbon Treaty should be used in some fields to have a certain number of states going on the way of integration at a speed more intense than the others.
So let's stay with this theme of Europe and the world. Are you satisfied with the European action in Libya?
In
Libya. Do you think the right choice was made? Do you think it's being conducted in the right way? Are you satisfied with how Europe has been involved?
I think that the right choice was made. I agree also with the arguments which have been put forward yesterday evening by President Obama, and they do not interest only America. If it is being conducted correctly, perhaps it's too early to say it. But by sure, the fact that there has been a division among the principal member states of the Union is a very negative element. I don't understand personally very well the motivations of the German Chancellor to stay out of this common action. I don't understand very well. I don't know if it had anything to do with local election in Germany, but perhaps one of the problems in Europe is not to be so much conditioned by any election which is going to take place in a country or in another one. And leaders, as the word says, suggests, should not follow the opinion polls, should lead the citizens, and also give the right direction, having the force to persuade them that it is the right direction. On the contrary, if they are so scared by the risk of losing votes and so heavily conditioned by the opinion polls, they cannot lead.
So let me follow up with a somewhat delicate question. Both in Bosnia, which the World Court qualified as a genocide, think of it, for the second time in the 20th century, a genocide of a religious minority in the heart of Europe, 100 kilometers from Rome. And now in Libya, we see that when occasionally there needs to be a use of force, Europe always needs the Americans. Do you think it was a mistake back in the 1950s when the idea of a European defense community was defeated in the French Parliament? Italy voted in favor. Do you think Europe would have been better off?
Italy didn't even have the time to vote for or against, because before an Italian vote there was the French vote and the story was over. I think historically it looks to be a mistake, to have been a mistake. And now there could be a possibility written in the famous Lisbon Treaty, which foresees a structured cooperation. We are always inventing very complicated words. A structured cooperation among some member states who have more military capabilities in order to put together their resources. And that would be really essential, because we have such a duplication of military structures, state by state, and such a waste of military expenditure that all of us, we would gain a lot if we were determined in creating this kind of cooperation. Partially giving a compensation to the old mistake of the failure of the European Defence Authority.
So, from one delicate question to another one. In the chair you were sitting, before you sat President Clinton and Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and Manuel Barroso and others. And all of them I've asked the following question. Clinton included, there's an undeniable streak of anti-Americanism in European politics, both at the European level and also in some of the member states, including Italy. How do you explain this streak of anti-Americanism which one finds in European politics and in Italian politics?
Well, I don't know if it is correct to, in this case, to speak of Europe as a whole. Because, for instance, in Italy there has never been, nor in politics, nor among the citizens, nor among the intellectuals, never a superiority complex looking at America, at American culture or at the American way of life. Some other country very close to ours, I would say yes. I would say not Italy, as a matter of fact. Also because there was a natural sympathy and there was so much Italian blood in this country, and we never forgot. But during fascism, there was an anti-American propaganda, very strong, very strong. Of course, fascism had la impudenza, I would say, la impudenza.
The cheek.
Yeah, to accuse the United States of racism, things like this. So there was a horrible, deviating fascist propaganda against the states.
That's the kettle calling the pot black.
But after the Second World War, of course, Italy and Italian politics resented very much of the Cold War, of the splitting of world into zones, into areas, into blocks, and the Italian left chose the other bloc, was sympathetical with the Soviet bloc against the Western bloc. And that, of course, created problems also in an anti-American sense, starting from the idea that anyhow America was the policeman of the world, that America was imperialist, and so on. It didn't last so much. It lasted, according to me, a couple of decades. And then there was a much more thoughtful approach also by the left to the problems of the real America. And we had more recently, after also the end of the Cold War, much criticism about the so-called unilateralism of the foreign policy of the United States. That's true. But I wouldn't say that that represented a profound streak of anti-Americanism. And now we must say that there is no more any trace of unilateral ideology in American foreign policy. And when I heard the recently elected President of the United States speaking of America, say we are humble, we must be humble. Well, long live America.
There was an incident some years ago when an American administration, shamefully I should add, denied you an entry visa. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, if you are interested in this old story, I'll tell it as shortly as possible. In 1975, I received an invitation signed by 4 universities. If I'm not wrong, Harvard University, Yale University, Princeton, and Cornell University, prestigious university, inviting me for a tour in the States, giving lectures and having public debates. And I filled the application for the visa. Some weeks went by without receiving any answer. And one day I received a letter from Professor Stanley Hoffman of the Harvard University, who was the principal promoter of this invitation, and he told me, I must tell you with great sorrow that I received a visit of a personality of the American administration. I don't want to quote any name, also because people who in that occasion did intervene to deny the visa have become very good friends of mine. So I not name them. But this person said to Stanley Hoffman, you must withdraw the invitation to Mr. Napolitano. He refused, and he wrote a letter to the New York Times, which was published, telling the story, but I didn't get the visa. Three years later, Stanley Hoffman said, well, be patient. When there will be positive conditions, we'll renew the invitation. And the invitation was renewed in 1978. The administration had changed. The president was Jimmy Carter, and I received the visa, and it was my first 15 days tour in the States. There still was a certain suspicion, you know, because the program I presented was a 15 days program, but at the last moment I received one more invitation for a lecture, I don't remember where, so I said I need longer term visa, and I received a new one, 16 days.
So this draws us a bit close to Italy. And I am going to ask you, you're the President of Italy, so I must explain to the audience, you know the style of teaching in the United States Law School is we don't wait for students to raise their hands, we call on them. But there's something called a pass. If they don't want to answer, they say pass, and I have to ask somebody else. So you get a free pass. This is a delicate moment in the life of Italy. I mean, it's an objective fact. You have a prime minister who is under indictment by one of your courts for troubling issues. There's a very tense parliamentary situation. Not an easy moment to be president.
Not an easy moment to be president, and not an easy moment for the country. Of course, I'll not make any comment on any personality of the political Italian spectre, of his personal questions or his judicial affairs. I'm speaking in general terms, and I think that the worst difficulty for myself as president, and probably also for the country, is what has been called in other periods in the American literature the phenomenon of hyper-partisanship. We suffer from a phenomenon of hyper-partisanship. There is no a normal dialectics between majority and opposition. There is a daily guerrilla. There is a reciprocal delegitimization. There is no dialogue. Nobody listens to the other. So this is a very heavy situation, and there is a risk of division of the country, and there is a risk of serious weakening of our prestige in the world. So my duty, according to the Constitution, Article 87, first the President of the Republic represents the national unity. My first duty is to put the accent on what unites Italy, not on what divides Italy, and to recall all Italians, all political parties, all social forces to the necessity of a certain acceptable and effective degree of national cohesion and national unity. This is my principal effort, with some results. Some results, it is not up to me to give an evaluation. I was satisfied personally, I must confess, the last week when I was in Rome, in Turin, in Milan, and in Varese, 5 days for the celebration of the 150th anniversary of our unity, and I found an enormous quantity of people, of citizens in the streets participating to all initiatives with such an enthusiasm that I said, well, perhaps to celebrate the anniversary and to recall what has been Italy in that period, because the memory has been weakened in the past decades, can be useful to have more pride, more trust, more critical consciousness of our weaknesses and of new challenges, and more sense of mission and national unity. And I hope it will fuel.
The polls tell us, President, that by a long measure you are the most popular political figure in Italy among Italians, and that in the rest of the world, as I said when I welcomed you, you are seen as somebody representing the really best in Italy. And yet at the same time you have taken a very robust view of your role as a president and your prerogatives as a president. You have not been a rubber stamp president. I remember in the Anglo affair, that was a little bit like the Chavo affair here in the United States. You refused to sign a law that was put to you by the government. And even a week or two ago, you took a certain distance about the nomination of somebody as a minister. So that is somebody who does not see his role as president simply in ceremonial terms. So maybe you could say a word more about how you understand this role.
If I can give some boring details.
Go ahead.
Yes. The president
we are lawyers.
The President of the Republic in Italy has no executive powers. It has a certain number of functions which are described in the Constitution, and of course there is a general concept of the role which was designed by the members of the Constituent Assemblies in 1946 and 47. They had the idea of a President of the Republic as a figure which wouldn't mix himself or herself with the daily political struggle. There is an expression, I think the first to use it was very long time ago, Benjamin Constant, a neutral power, a neutral power. He should have, and I'm trying to have, a role of moderation, a role of impartiality in order to guarantee the respect of constitutional rights and equilibria, but without entering choices, executive choices or legislative choices, which are vested in the executive and in the parliament. But in our system, any bill can be presented by single parliamentarians or by the government, the Council of Ministers, and to enter into force has to be approved by both chambers, by both houses. At the same time, there is a special provision in extraordinary cases when there is a special necessity or urgency. The executive can adopt a so-called decree which enters immediately into force, and within 2 months it has to be ratified by the parliament. But that decree cannot be emanated without the signature of the President of the Republic. And I am convinced, as many of my predecessors, I am convinced that I have the duty to check if there really was such an extraordinary necessity and urgency to adopt a decree, this kind of legislative act. In the case Englaro, I didn't find that there was such a necessity. And even more, as there had been a sentence, a judgment, a decision of Cassazione, which is our court of last resort, I think that it was not correct by a legislative act of the government, even if ratified by the parliament, and in the meanwhile signed by me, to revert a decision of the Supreme Court in Italy. That's why I refused to sign that decree. In other cases, well, the ministers, formally the Constitution says that the President of the Council has to propose ministers to the President of the Republic. But I recognize that when the President of the Council represents a parliamentary majority which is founded on a vast consensus of the electors, well, I cannot object to much. In this case, I cannot say, according to me, Professor Weil would be a better justice minister than a member of Berlusconi's party. So in these cases, I am much more prudent to say yes or no, to sign or not to sign. At the end, also in a recent case you were quoting, I gave some advices. According to me, it was not opportune that kind of nomination. But as the President of the Council insisted, I signed. It is your responsibility. I respect your choice.
Bravo, Presidente.
Well, it's a rather difficult exercise, I can assure you.
The reaction in your country and around the world seems to suggest that it's difficult, but you're exercising it admirably. I want to ask you on one more substantive issue, which has put Italy in the public eye around the world, and that's the problem of immigrants. Lampedusa, more specifically, and more generally, the problem of immigrants to Italy and to Europe. I don't want to display any opposite kind of American superiority, but in terms of integration of immigrants, the United States seems to have been quite successful. And Europe seems to be not yet found exactly the right model. And inevitably, it's going to become a continent of immigration because of the demographics. So what are your views, both on the immediate problem and on the longer term? How should Europe and Italy face this problem?
Well, once more, the main problem is the reluctance of national governments to accept European integrated policies, because we need a common European immigration and asylum policy, not 27 policies in this field, as many as are the member states. And there is still a certain difficulty even in implementing principles which have been written in common documents. Anyhow, I would distinguish Lampedusa today, the present emergency, and the general problem. The present emergency is not a purely Italian problem. We must be clear. It's not acceptable that other member countries of the European Union consider it a purely Italian problem. Lampedusa is not the Italian frontier, it's the European frontier. And the problems of people who come to Europe because they arrive in Lampedusa, which is so close, but they think to have arrived in Europe, and not specifically and necessarily in Italy. Well, the problem of these people must be dealt with by the complex of European institutions and bodies. As regards out of this emergency, which of course is a result of turmoil in Tunisia and perhaps also of what's happening in Libya, although until this moment particularly Tunisians are arriving more than Libyans. But the point for Italy is that after having been the number one, perhaps, immigration country in the world, in the past 20 years it has suddenly become a country of immigration at a very accelerated speed. 20 years ago, we had not even 1% of population living in Italy composed with immigrants. Now, immigrants represent the 7% of the population living in Italy. And this acceleration has created a lot of problems and tensions difficult to solve. Anyhow, I did my best in 96, 98, when I was the Minister of the Interior, following this criteria. We cannot receive anybody. We must have a planning. We can every year accept so many immigrants according also to the needs of our economy and to the possibility of integration in our societies. And we adopted a law. I put forward a bill which was adopted by the Parliament for fixing quotas, country by country. This year, 10,000 will be accepted coming from Tunisia or from Albania or from Senegal. Second, of course, a strong determination to fight the phenomenon of clandestine immigration, illegal presence in Italy, also because illegal presence of immigrants in Italy means very much labor force for criminal organizations. Third, we must find agreements with the countries of origin, both cooperating with them to have a better economic growth and better living conditions in order to contain this pressure to emigrate towards Italy or Europe. And at the same time, we must have a commitment by those countries to control who comes in Italy, where does he come from, and if possible, to have him back in his country, the so-called readmission agreements I signed for many countries, with many countries of origin.
Are you optimistic?
Well, don't make me repeat my usual expression. I cannot afford the luxury to be pessimist.
As is often the case, I look at the watch and we are rapidly running out of time. So I want to come back a little bit to Giorgio Napolitano, the person. Tell us what was the most challenging moment in your public life.
My personal political life, or in the political life I was participating in. Because, the most dramatic moment was the period of terrorism, undoubtedly. For the country, for the left, for myself, if you think, of course, particularly of the homicide, the kidnapping and the homicide of Aldo Mauro. But it was a terrible period.
And what was your role in public life in Italy at that period?
I was a member of parliament. I had a relevant position in my party and in relations with the government in that epoch. It was a national solidarity government headed by Andreotti. My party at the epoch, the Communist Party, had no participation in the government but in the majority. And I represented my party for relations with the government in the field of economic and social problems. So I had a certain high responsibility. It was a terrible period because from one day to another you didn't know who could be killed absolutely unforeseeably, because Red Brigades were killing blindly symbols, a judge, a policeman, a politician, just to create emotion and destabilization. That was, I think, the worst period. There are more personal questions which regard the life also of the party and of the movement in which I was in the past decades active, and these are other things, if you are interested.
And what was a gratifying moment in your public life?
Well, when some decisions were taken by the parliament corresponding to our long battles, long fights, for instance, when there was a statute for the social rights of working people. That was a great satisfaction, a great victory. Or also when there was the decision to nationalize the electric industry, which was considered a monopoly. I was active in those parliamentary fights, and there were, but so many other moments. When we elected Sandro Pertini President of the Republic, I was one of parliamentarians voting for him, and he has been a great figure of anti-fascism, of socialism, and of democracy in Italy. Well, I can say there have been many gratifying moments. Also, following my personal battle inside my party and inside the left. Well, anytime I succeeded in pushing forward my opinions, which were minority opinions in some periods, I was gratified, of course. When I said...
but historically you had a great success in the democratization and of the Italian left, etc.
Yes, I can say so. The change took place more or less according to my convictions, but it was a too slow process. And I think that the left is still paying a price for that slowness.
President, we've all understood that you are an impatient person. Are you a little bit concerned? There are a lot of commentators now who lament a certain weakness in the current state of the leadership of the left as an alternative. Are you a bit concerned? I mean, historically...
Well, I am completely out of this world, as you can understand. I have no privileged relations with any political party. My only serious worry is not to have a correct dialectics between opposed political forces. Of course, I think that for democracy it's necessary to have a strong opposition and not only a strong government. But I cannot help if the opposition is not always strong enough.
So you mentioned Sandro Pertini. If my memory serves me right, you, like him, went to watch Italy play in the World Cup final. Are you a football fan?
I was in another World Cup final in Germany a few months or a few weeks after being elected. I didn't jump like Sandro Pertini, but independently from this, I was gratified by that victory, although I am not such involved in football fanatism.
So as somebody like myself who forever will be tifo for Fiorentina, it's useless to ask you which team you support.
Well, I am only conditioned by a son of mine, you know, who's a fan of Lazio. And he's courageous because Lazio didn't give him too many satisfactions.
You will understand that this is the most delicate statement that he made this evening. Would you let us know your favorite novel or novelist?
Dr. Faustus by Thomas Mann.
And poet or poem? Poet or poem?
Well, well, contemporary poetry, I don't know, I can quote a name which is probably unknown or very little known, Eugenio Montale, Ossi di Seppia.
Do you like music?
Yes, very much.
What's your favorite piece of music?
Well, I love very much classical music, so I can quote so many.
But is it lyrica or?
Also lyrica, but particularly symphony music and chamber music.
So if we played Desert Island Disc, you were stranded on a desert island and you could only have 3 CDs with you.
Oh, hard choice. Well, probably one Mozart, one Beethoven, and I don't know, perhaps one Bartók.
Bela Bartók, very interesting. And a favorite dish?
Unsurprisingly, spaghetti. With any
aglio e olio?
Yes, with any kind of sauce, garlic and oil, or the classical one is tomato and basil.
In a minute, the Dean of the Law School will come to the stage to award you with the Medal of New York University. But as my last question, sometimes affectionately, you are known as Re Umberto, King Umberto. Can you explain that?
No, well, it was a joke which didn't last very much, because after the proclamation of the Republic, Re Umberto was very quickly forgotten. At that epoch, you understand, more than 60 years ago, somebody thought there was a certain resemblance between me and Umberto when he was younger, because he was born a certain number of years before me. Well, but it was an absolutely innocent joke.
But I can say you will not be forgotten.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
President, I want to give you some little gifts before you get the important medal from the law school. So one is a book that made a big impression, The Sacco Vanzetti Affair, America on Trial, by Moshe Temkin. If you ever have time, it's a very well analysis of that. And then my own little present, La Costituzione dell'Europa, with La Vucceria on the cover.
Yes, I thank you very much. I confess I read it, but I get more to it.
And the final little gift to prove to all of these people here that one never gets old, one is always young. This is a CD of a wonderful American singer, an immigrant, Regina Spektor, Begin to Hope.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
La Baronessa, prego. So now the Dean.
So good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on this special occasion. We're delighted to have all of you with us. New York University trustees, law school trustees, faculty members, students, many friends, Emile Noel fellows, colleagues from other institutions, journalists and researchers, ambassadors and dignitaries from the Italian Embassy and Consulate, and the President's delegation. NYU President John Sexton was called to China at the last minute for university meetings and is unable to join us tonight. He sends his regrets, Mr. President, and his very best wishes. It is a privilege and pleasure to lead this evening's ceremony on behalf of President Sexton. The Presidential Medal of New York University is awarded at the discretion of the President of the University to leaders of extraordinary accomplishment. These individuals lend inspiration to the university's mission to be an international center of scholarship, teaching, and research, defined by a culture of academic excellence and innovation. Past recipients exemplify the very best in their respective fields as scholars, statesmen, artists, business leaders, and philanthropists. They have included President Nelson Mandela, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, composer and songwriter Alan Menken, philanthropist Edgar Bronfman, and NYU own former Senior Vice President for External Affairs Naomi Levine. To this illustrious list, we add a statesman whose outstanding contributions exemplify honor, ethics, and public service. It is now my distinct pleasure to invite His Excellency, Mr. Giorgio Napolitano, to the podium to receive the 2011 New York University Presidential Medal. I would also like to invite Baroness Mariuccia Zerilli Marimo, the founder of Casa Italiana Zerilli Marimo, a former NYU trustee, and one of the most respected and eminent members of the university community. In recognition of our recipient's leadership and legacy of courage, I am pleased to read the Presidential Medal's citation. Giorgio Napolitano, President of the Republic of Italy, you're a seasoned statesman, a renowned authority on international relations and European affairs, and a powerful and effective champion of parliamentary democracy. Born in your beloved Naples, a law graduate of the University of Naples, Federico II, you fought Nazis and fascists during World War II, gained election to the Italian parliament as a member of the Partito Comunista Italiano in 1953, and were instrumental in moving the party towards the European model of social democracy. Joining the Partito Democratico after the Italian Communist Party disbanded in 1991, you were subsequently elected Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies and served as Minister of the Interior. In 2005, you were appointed Senator for Life. Esteemed for your leadership in effecting the historic compromise between the Italian left and right, you were an early and steadfast supporter of European integration and the strengthening of democratic institutions in both Italy and Europe. Emerging from retirement to be elected president in 2006, you have been an anchor of stability during times of grave political and constitutional crisis, exerting deft and decisive leadership to ensure the authentic exercise and orderly transition of power. NYU is honored to join a list of celebrated universities in the United States at which you have lectured: Harvard, Princeton, Yale, the University of Chicago, and the University of California at Berkeley. A prolific and persuasive author, you have given us a seminal memoir. Giorgio Napolitano, you are an eloquent voice of reason, toleration, and democratic values. Throughout your distinguished career, you have demonstrated uncommon courage and intellectual integrity, fierce fair-mindedness and moral rigor, earning the respect and admiration of members of all political parties and lovers of liberty everywhere. New York University is proud to present to you its Presidential Medal.
Beautiful. Really, really, really.
Thank you so much for being here.
Just a moment. I don't know if you have.
Oh, what an honor.
For the 150th anniversary.
Oh, thank you. What an honor.
So, thank you very much. Di nuovo grazie.
Grazie a lei,
Grazie,
Presidente.
grazie.
Grazie.
So thank you all for attending this evening's lecture. Obviously, we'd have loved to invite the whole group to dinner, but the group is too large. So I would like to ask those who were invited to join the President for dinner to please exit on the left side of the auditorium through room 110. That's sort of that way, where you can pick up your coats and exit to West 3rd Street. I hope that all others will join us for the post-lecture reception across the hall in Greenberg Lounge. Again, thank you for coming today and sharing this wonderful day for New York University and for our law school. Thank you so much.